In the next lessons, we will discuss a very big and important topic. We will try to understand the core of rendering. We will talk about Vray Image Sampler. I'll divide this topic into a few lessons as we have to discuss a few puzzle pieces that will form the main concept. And I will try to explain that using a few images that you see here, so we understand indeed those things that form the base of any rendering. First of all, we must understand the principles of perspective. By the way, for those who want to learn a bit more about this, you can find my previous lessons on perspective. Some do consider them too technical and a bit far from real, colorful and interesting design, but they form the understanding of that gray stage. That is the base on which we apply our colorful brushes and design. So shortly we must start with how we are seeing any object in general. We see all our objects using perspective rules. We can see here an image of 2D perspective concepts. Usually we use 2D perspective in our renders. And here you can see another image that actually represents an old method used to create, let's say, the first exact renders. Well, of course they were painted on a paper, but we talk about the rules that were developed to create 3D representation of an object, or should I say, a project. Creating projects before starting them, especially intuitively when you can miss some details, it's of course a yes. That's why using rules to create renders of our future projects should stick to a technical demand towards any interior designer. Well, using these methods when there were no computers, step by step brought to development of cameras. And by the way, we will use Vray physical camera. We will choose Vray and we will use Vray physical camera. We will leave for now everything on default. There are a bunch of settings here. By the way, you can use the Vray physical camera from here as well. We can find cameras here. We will choose Vray and we will use Vray physical camera. We will leave for now everything on default. You can see here a lot of settings. They are important, but we will get them a bit later. So back to our image. You can see this man is looking from one point using his eyes towards a building, and we can see a canvas as well. This was then a paper probably, now it is a render, but the principle is the same. So cameras, no matter if they are real or in 3D software, they are simulating a human eye. We are looking at this object using perspective. And finally we fix this view, which is by the way the camera's position in 3ds Max. Well, in reality as well, but we are talking about 3ds Max. It's a virtual simulation. And our camera also got a position towards our object or our project. So if we would try to repeat that, we'd have to create a camera that will represent our point of view or our eye. Let's create a camera, a physical camera, a Vray physical camera in 3ds Max. We have a camera and a target. Next we see here on these images the same principle. We got the point of view and a 3D object. Of course it's a simplified version. In our projects we will have a lot of 3D objects, and between them we see a canvas. That canvas is actually our render. In the previous lessons we talked about the proportion and ratio of our canvas and how that impacts a lot our perception, and by the way the client's perception as well. We are creating our renders and develop a 3D project. We will talk about interior design, but it depends what you are doing. So we said a good ratio of our canvas increases the perception of proportion in our project. You can't have a bad ratio and expect that your render will look okay. So we can see on these images this canvas, and we can see that this man is actually tracing lines towards the edges of a 3D object or objects. We can say in other words that he is trying to identify geometry. And after that he is trying to draw the geometry on his canvas. You can see that here and here as well. So from our camera we trace or we draw, but we call that trace, lines towards our 3D objects or our project. Now let's get to max and let's load our previous render. By pushing this button, you load Vray frame buffer, and using history, we can load our previous render or our canvas. And we remember that we got 2000 by 1000 pixels. I'll get to that in a second. This is very important. Now in our render, we have an interior. I'll try to recreate that in a very simplified version. We need for now only the principle. This will be the same 3D object we are seeing here on our images. Let's create the 4 armchairs and the sofa as well. We also say that we are using the same view like we did here in our ready render, and we are looking at it using our Vray physical camera. So our camera, it's our eye, like on this image. Our object, it's our project. Now we need the canvas. By the way, you can see here that after tracing lines, our object on our canvas is smaller. The perspective rules start to interfere. Now let's talk in detail about our canvas. For now, we know that it is 2000 by 1000 pixels. If I'll try to repeat the same method used by this man, I'll use instead a pencil. This instrument is called freehand from Splines. And by the way, I will need a paper or a canvas so I can recreate the same actions. Let's create a plane, for example. This will be our canvas. Our plane got segments. I'll use them instead of pixels, so I can explain all this in a simple way. They are not square for now, I'll make them in a second. You can see in our real render the pixels. They are square. And if we would look on this image with rules, we can say that in the end, this is important in the end, each pixel must have one color. Although in the process of sampling, which is what we are doing right now, I'll get to that in a second. We can have inside our pixel a few colors. This is about quality, image quality. We will get to that. So if we would try to recreate what we see on this image, retracing the edges of our 3D object on a canvas, I could do this in a simple way. Of course, we are not drawing in 3D, but let's assume that we do. I'll draw a few shapes so we can get the principle. We will draw our 3D object on our canvas, but if we talk about a pencil, we don't care about pixels. But in our case, we are using a canvas with pixels. So let's add the same number of pixels to our plane. We cannot actually add more than 1000 pixels. I cannot add 2000 pixels. I'll input 1000 by 500 so we can get the same situation only divided by 2. It's not that critical. The principle is a lot more important, and we will maintain our pixels in a square shape. So we said that one pixel in the end must have one color. But what about situations when we have not straight shapes, like here? Well, we need to subdivide that pixel so we can obtain something very close to a curve, unless we will obtain something like 1-bit images. This is about color depth. We will talk about that a bit later. Keep in mind we are working in 3ds Max with vector shapes, but when we render we obtain raster. These are two different formats. While vector never loses quality, raster actually does. We begin to talk about image quality here. We will get to that in more depth later. Remember our big formats of high quality? We will use them only for final renders, but about that also a bit later. It's about the quality of our image, and this is raster. In the next lesson, we will try to understand how we can divide our pixels, what is a sample, and how we can define image quality.